Hi, it's Katrina. The Liber Linteus. The Liber Linteus is the most extended Etruscan text still preserved, dating back to the 3rd century BC. Unfortunately, most of the text remains untranslated because hardly anybody knows anything about the ancient Etruscan language. Using the few words that have been translated, experts believe the text was some kind of ritual calendar, outlining when the most important ceremonies of the time were to be held. But here's the craziest part about the fabric. It was discovered back in the 1800s being used as mummy wrappings. A mummy was purchased in the city of Alexandria in 1848, transported to Zagreb in Croatia, and preserved at their local archaeological museum. At the museum, researchers realized the female mummy was wrapped tightly in a linen text written in the ancient Etruscan language. The Liber Linteus was written directly on this woman's mummy wrappings. Chances are it was some kind of way to save money, or maybe the manuscript just wasn't necessary anymore. Whatever the case, it's one of the few untranslated documents of its kind left in the world, a discarded text from over 2,000 years ago, used as mummy bandages. Greek philosophers and the aliens. The concept of alien life goes further back than the first reports of aliens at Area 51 in the 1940s. Science expert Wade Rausch recently wrote a book after years of research tracing over 2,500 years of alien speculation back to the days of ancient Greece. The Greek philosopher Anaxagoras was one of the first to suggest that a different race of beings might inhabit the moon. Plato and Aristotle disagreed, saying they believed Earth was the source of all gravity and is the very center of the universe. Anaxagoras was the first to suggest the Earth was floating in an infinite void of nothingness. And believe it or not, the philosopher Epicurus was the first to inadvertently create the idea of the multiverse. He wrote that there is an unlimited number of cosmos, and some are like ours, while others are way different. The Roman poet Lucretius agreed, noting that there are other Earths inhabited by various tribes of humans and different breeds of beasts. I wonder what they would think now with all the knowledge we've gained since then. Persian wind catchers. We can't talk about ancient technology without mentioning the air conditioners of Persia. According to the experts, people who lived in Persia over 2,000 years ago were better at staying cool in the hotter months than most of us are today. And that's saying something, considering we have real air conditioning in our homes. At least 87% of US homes have air conditioners, accounting for roughly 12% of residential energy use. But before we started pumping cold air into our houses, the Persians were designing their houses with hot summers in mind. Extreme heat and scorching temperatures had them developing wind catchers, or badgir in ancient Persian. A wind catcher was a tower structure extending from the roof of a building. It looked a lot like a chimney, but was used for harnessing cool winds and redirecting them inside the home. So imagine if your house had a giant scoop sticking out of it, sucking in cold air and naturally cooling off your place in the summer months. It's ingenious, yet not exactly a design most people are interested in. Plus, it wouldn't work very well for large apartment buildings with many rooms. But for single-family homes, wind catchers could be the natural solution to hot summer days, energy-free, and it was the Persians who figured it out thousands of years ago. Would you want one of these in your house? Ancient Egyptian temple in Tennessee. In 1934, the Tennessee Valley Authority was busy constructing a dam that would flood much of the Clinch River. One part of the area they were going to flood included an ancient Native American mound belonging to the Hopewell culture. Because of this, archaeologists were sent to quickly excavate the site. When they were there, they came upon the ruins of an ancient structure. This old structure was built from wood and stone and didn't look like anything found in any Native American sites in the entire country. It was completely different, leading archaeologists to speculate it was built by another group of people. British Egyptologist James Rendell Harris from the London Museum identified the structure as an Egyptian temple. He believed that Egyptians had crossed the ocean, established a settlement, and built the first temple in the New World. This would have been over 1,000 years before Christopher Columbus ever arrived. James published a brief article in 1935 explaining his theory, speculating in the report that Egyptian traders were mining copper in the Americas and bringing it back to the Mediterranean. They established a massive colony in East Tennessee, but vanished for some mysterious reason. We don't know if this is true or false, and sadly the temple was flooded back in the 1930s, and there is no trace of it left. So, if the Egyptians had a settlement in Tennessee, all evidence is long gone. Powerful sticky rice mortar. The Great Wall of China is one of the most spectacular ancient engineering projects ever undertaken. Construction started around the year 220 BC, commissioned by the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang. Some people think it can be seen from space, but not according to Yang Liwei, China's first man in space. The scenery was very beautiful, Yang told Chinese TV when he returned to Earth, but I didn't see the Great Wall. His comments were taken, in some quarters, as proof that the story about the Great Wall is nothing more than a myth. But one thing most people don't know is that the wall is held together by a secret ingredient. Scientists from the Zhejiang University in China looked at the makeup of the mortar used to build the Great Wall, only to discover something unexpected. This mortar was a unique blend of limestone, water, and sticky rice. The mixture was the first composite mortar ever made by humans to include an organic and inorganic material. So the brilliant Chinese inventors put the wall together using pretty much nothing but limestone and sticky rice. The scientists did some tests, curious about just how effective this material is. They made their own mortar with and without sticky rice, and what they found was that the sticky rice made the material significantly more stable. It's a highly suitable material for restoring ancient masonry. It's because of the sticky rice that the Great Wall has held itself together for so long, as well as other buildings from ancient China. Sticky rice helped tombs and pagodas and grand temples survive countless earthquakes and thousands of years in the elements. Can you believe it? The Serapium Sarcophagi. In 1850, Auguste Mariette journeyed to Egypt to collect ancient manuscripts. Instead, he went on an expedition out to Saqqara, an ancient Egyptian necropolis. He discovered the head of a sphinx sticking out from the desert sand. He cleared the sand away and found a road hiding beneath. He then followed the road to the entrance of a lost catacomb. Inside, there were 24 giant sarcophagi. To this very day, nobody knows precisely how these enormous coffins were moved to the site in the middle of the desert, nor how they were moved underground and installed in their notches on the walls. The mainstream theory is that the site was used to bury Apis bulls for 1,400 years. A total of 60 Apis bulls were supposedly buried here. Each is believed to be an incarnation of the god Ptah. The issue is that nobody's ever found the bull mummies. And that's not all. The boxes were too big for the bulls, larger than necessary to bury such an animal. It's also strange the sarcophagi here were made out of granite instead of the usual limestone, which was much easier to work with. This was probably a great place for burying bulls, but the effort taken to do such a thing in the desert was immense and almost unbelievable. Each sarcophagus weighed roughly 88,000 pounds, with each lid weighing about 44,000 pounds. So what were these coffins used for? The disc-eyed giants. The disc-eyed giants of Monte Prama in Sardinia are extremely strange. A farmer discovered them at an Iron Age burial necropolis on this Italian island back in 1974. Peculiar stone sculptures of giants, things shaped like men, but not quite the same. They almost look like a race of extraterrestrial titans, enormous humanoids with eyes shaped in layers of spinning discs. The first few statues were found in the 70s, and 2 more were just found during recent excavations. The newest giants are just like the old giants, crafted by the hands of the Nuragic culture sometime around 950 BC. And even though researchers have had 50 years to study them, they have come no closer to understanding their purpose or who they represented. One thing to keep in mind is that the Nuragic civilization blossomed in the early Bronze Age. They built stone fortresses with great, imposing towers. This was way back in 1800 BC. These days, there are over 7,000 such stone fortresses left across the landscape of Sardinia, called Nuraghe. It was from these great stone fortresses that the people defended their island nation until their eventual defeat in the 2nd century AD. These people were ancient, one of the first complex societies to crop up in the Mediterranean. And so it's a little weird that they erected giant statues of what looked like aliens. Sure, they may have represented ordinary men, but it seems unlikely that they are so different from anything else found anywhere in Europe. Instead, the Nuragic were probably inspired by something else. Some people say perhaps by visitors from beyond the stars. Ancient Egyptian makeup. Not only did the ancient Egyptians build the most incredible pyramids on the planet, tombs under the earth and great granite sarcophagi in the middle of the desert, but they also perfected makeup. A recent study from the journal Scientific Reports claims Egyptian makeup was far more complicated and diverse than anyone ever thought. The ancient Egyptians used kohl, a cosmetic worn traditionally since the earliest days of the Egyptian kings and queens. Dark eye makeup wasn't just applied for aesthetic reasons, but also for religious functions, therapy, and hygiene. Kohl was so popular that it was used all across the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. It was a kind of eyeliner that doubled as a mascara for the eyelashes. Researchers looked at 11 kohl containers kept at the Petrie Museum in London. What they found were traces of over 8 new minerals they hadn't known were in kohl, including new silicon-based materials. They also identified at least 6 new organic materials, things like animal fats and plant oils. This means that the ancient Egyptians were really at the top of the global game of science. They were master builders and could combine dozens of different organic and inorganic materials to create makeup. The Apocrypha. The Apocrypha isn't precisely an ancient technology, but it is an essential piece of one of the oldest books in the world. Not every piece of religious writing ever became canon. Today, everything in the New Testament is technically biblical canon, meaning it's all authenticated and confirmed as legitimate Holy Scripture. Plenty of stories and writings by Christian and Jewish authors were left out when the New Testament was put together. These texts became apocrypha, meaning they weren't authenticated, could be false, and weren't actual Christian scripture. But of course, the correct scripture was up for interpretation. The year was 1546, and St. Jerome had just finished translating the Old Testament into Latin. He had serious doubts about some works he had just translated and voiced his concern. But those in power didn't care. They declared the New Testament entirely accurate and excluded only a handful of books like the First and Second Book of Esdras. Not every branch of the Church accepted the same books. The Roman Catholics considered many of the writings to be non-accurate, and the Ethiopian Church pretty much accepted everything. What happened in the end was that a lot of different versions of the Bible got made, with some stories being seen as nonsense by some and as scripture by others. And this went on over time, with more parts being cut and more parts being put in. So now we have many branches of what started as the same religion, but changed dramatically based on which version of the book church leaders deemed accurate. A prehistoric bullet hole. In 1922, an ancient hominin skull was discovered in a limestone cave in Zambia. It was first believed the skull belonged to the ancient species Homo rhodesiensis, but was later attributed to the species Homo heidelbergensis. Experts have since confirmed that the person died sometime between 125 and 300,000 years ago. The skull was found to have a bullet hole in the left side of the cranium, right near the ear. This is weird because obviously the skull's owner lived a very long time before firearms, and yet the hole appears to have been formed by a high-velocity projectile. It looks like a bullet fired from a rifle. And to make things stranger, the skull of a prehistoric auroch, an extinct wild cattle, was found a few thousand miles away in Siberia with an identical bullet hole in the forehead. Nobody knows what put these holes in the skulls, but there is plenty of speculation. Some say ancient visitors with highly advanced weapons came down to do some hunting. Mainstream scientists are generally quiet on the subject, or simply dismiss the bullet holes as conspiracy theories. Roman slavery. The Roman Empire practiced slavery in one of the worst and most barbaric ways in history. Slaves were so prevalent in Rome that they made up roughly 1/3 of the Roman population. They were involved in every aspect of Roman life, from helping with the children, to working in the fields, to fighting in the army. Practically every Roman citizen had at least one slave from the many conquered territories as the Roman Empire spread, and they were vital to the success of Rome. Slaves worked everywhere and were considered the norm. They were even working on important engineering projects such as roads, aqueducts, and buildings. They blended easily with the population, so it was hard to tell slaves apart from the plebeians. At one point, according to PBS, the Senate once considered a plan to make them wear special clothing so that they could be identified at a glance. The idea was rejected because the Senate feared that if slaves saw how many of them were working in Rome, they might be tempted to join forces and rebel. The peak of slavery in Rome was between 200 BC and 200 AD, and it was pretty scary because it could practically happen to anyone. Pirates or bandits could force people into slavery if they found themselves too far from their house. There were gangs that would just go around kidnapping people and selling them. Ordinary Roman citizens who got into too much debt had their things taken from them, and their creditors sold them into slavery. They made criminals into slaves if they were not executed. Desperate Roman citizens would even sell their own children into slavery for money. And then, of course, there were the thousands and thousands of people from foreign lands the Romans captured, enslaved, and then allowed to breed so that they had a never-ending supply of human tools. In ancient Rome, they considered enslaved people property. This meant they were often treated with extreme cruelty and could even be killed with no punishment. Owners often subjected slaves to horrible treatment and paraded them through the streets as signs of wealth and good fortune. Not all Romans agreed with the practice, as over time many had experienced it for themselves in one form or another, and sometimes it was just too close to home. Politicians and philosophers such as Seneca argued that slaves should at least be treated fairly. While slaves were used for essential labor, there was sometimes the possibility to be freed or buy freedom, and this prospect encouraged slaves to be obedient and hardworking. This didn't happen very often, but it helped keep captives in line. Crucifixions. There are numerous historical documents that record the horrific practice of crucifixions in ancient Rome, but you might be surprised to learn that archaeologists have never found much proof of this dark Roman pastime until now. In the north of Italy, researchers came across a lesion on the foot of a skeleton from 2,000 years ago. They found the skeleton in a Roman burial site that showed the first concrete evidence of execution by crucifixion. Until recently, many historians had chalked crucifixions up as myth, just something the Romans wrote about but never actually did very often. But seeing the skeleton of a man who the Romans nailed to a cross shatters the idea of the myth and makes it a ghoulish reality. Researcher Emanuela Gualdi from the University of Ferrara says despite the poorly preserved conditions of the skeleton, she and her team saw evidence a spike had been driven through the ankles. She suspects the reason there isn't much proof is because most crucifixions were done with rope, not actual nails. It's now the second confirmed case of a crucifixion that happened 2,000 years ago, after the first one was found in Britain. And if there are two confirmed cases, the horrible punishment may have been just as widespread as most people think. The destruction of Jerusalem. In the year 70 AD, the Roman general Titus stormed the city of Jerusalem and burned it to the ground. It was one of the darkest and most deliberately cruel campaigns of terror the Romans ever embarked upon. They laid siege to the city, cut off its food supply, and waited as the Jewish people inside slowly starved to death. Then, at the end of the summer, when they were weak and broken, the Romans kicked down the doors and ransacked the city. They lit the Second Temple on fire, slaughtered Jewish soldiers, and cut down ordinary civilians. While the burning of the city was horrible, the wrath of the Roman soldiers was even worse. According to what the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus wrote about that day, General Titus had tried to stop his soldiers from burning everything and killing everyone. But the Roman soldiers had such a deep hatred for the people that they ignored their orders, pushed aside the centurions, and drowned in a bloodlust that left Jerusalem in ruins. Here's why the Romans hated the Jewish people so much. And before I continue, remember this went both ways. To the Jews, the Romans were despicable barbarians, even before they destroyed their greatest city. The thing was that the Romans had been under 2 centuries of Hellenistic rule and still worshipped their pagan gods. To the Jews, this was unacceptable, and to the Romans, the great god the Jewish people worshipped was just as offensive and ridiculous, and so their hatred became the desire to wipe out the other. Emperor Karakala. Emperor Karakala is remembered today for his legendary scowl. Even in surviving imperial busts of the emperor, he clearly looks angry and ready to do something crazy. His name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, and he ruled the Roman Empire from 211 to 217 AD. His father, Septimius Severus, took the throne after the death of the Emperor Commodus, and he raised both of his sons, Karakala and Geta, as his heirs, and he wanted them to be co-rulers after his death. But they were having none of it. Karakala had chosen the dark side. The rivalry between the brothers was fierce, and once their father died, Karakala had his brother killed by the Praetorian Guard, while Geta tried to hide in his mother's arms. Karakala then forbade his mother from mourning his death, and all images of Geta were destroyed. More stories of murder, cruelty, and incest followed him wherever he went. But of course, he was a complex man. As an emperor, he did a few good things. He built huge baths in Rome that are still standing today. He also gave Roman citizenship to all the inhabitants of the empire who weren't slaves. In the meantime, he also had his wife killed, and when he heard rumors spread that he was having an affair with his mother in Alexandria, he ordered a massacre of all the young men in the city. He showed insane hatred for his enemies, the Germans, Parthians, and Alexandrians. During a fake engagement party to one of his enemy's daughters, he had everyone killed. It was his unyielding hate for the tribes on the outer borders of Rome that ultimately led to his decline. He was obsessed with Alexander the Great and decided to seek more military glory. While out on campaign and probably tired of killing people, some of his men began to plot against him. The commander of his military guard decided to take action, and one day, while Karakala got off his horse to urinate, he stabbed him in the neck and he died. Karakala is still considered one of the most bloodthirsty tyrants that ever ruled. And after him, things started going downhill for the Roman Empire. The Punishment of Decimation. Decimation was considered the cruelest punishment in the Roman army. It was a practice used to punish army units that mutinied or ran away during battle. The word decimation comes from Latin, meaning removal of a tenth. This was because whichever group of soldiers was being punished would be broken into groups of 10. The 9 other members of the group would execute one man in each of those groups regardless of rank or reputation. 1/10 would be gone by the time the day was over. So imagine you fought in a squadron of 50 soldiers. Your squadron did something wrong and your commanders wanted to make you pay for it. This could be anything from cowardice to insubordination, so you would gather into groups of 10. Each group drew straws, and whoever got the shortest straw was then stoned or clubbed to death by his 9 comrades, all those men you were friends with, and they forced them to carry out your execution regardless of who was at fault. And if they didn't follow orders, the entire awful thing could be repeated. There are many reports of decimation throughout history, by an Italian general in World War I and Leon Trotsky against the deserters during the Russian Civil War. Do you think the Roman punishment of decimation was a clever way to keep soldiers in line? Or was it just another type of accepted cruelty of the ancient Romans? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Forbidden pleasures. One of the darkest parts of ancient Roman society has to do with the intimate relationships people had with one another. I won't go into too much detail, but all types of combinations between men and women and older men and younger men and women, everything was pretty socially acceptable. The Roman Empire was indeed way ahead of its time in terms of how people could, shall we say, show their affection. The Roman bedroom had pretty much no barriers, which was a good thing in some ways and in others not so much, especially if you were a woman or a slave. What historians find interesting is that in ancient Roman Latin, there was no specific word to define someone's sexuality. The Romans didn't view people as being one specific gender type or have a specific preference. It just wasn't a big deal for the Romans. They didn't view their bodies as shameful things to be covered up, and they didn't view intimacy with another person as being wrong, nor as being dictated based on biological gender. In this way, the Romans were ahead of the curve, but the society was still wildly patriarchal, and the man was the dominant authority in everything. Masculinity itself was governance and power, and so men were allowed to do basically whatever they wanted, and that translated from the outside world to the bedroom. The persecution of Christians. The Romans hated the Christians just as much as they hated the Jews. In the days before the collapse of the empire, they persecuted Christians obsessively. If it had been up to the emperors, they would have squashed the religion and never let it become as widespread as it did. There are many stories of crucifixions and throwing Christians to the lions in the Colosseum for entertainment. Most historians agree the persecution started with Emperor Nero. He introduced policies of persecution, which stuck in the minds of Europeans for centuries to come. When Rome caught fire in the year 64, Nero blamed it on the Christians to take the heat off himself. He even allegedly had a group of them dressed in wild beast skins and then torn apart by a pack of starving dogs. From that point on, the Christians were extremely unpopular in Rome, but they continued to thrive and they continued to grow in number. What's interesting is just how scared Romans were of Christians as they moved into their neighborhoods. People got nervous as their communities saw more and more Christian residents. The Romans lashed out in anger and fear, and now, all of these years later, in a powerful turn of events, Italy is one of the most Christian places in the world. The master of poison. Locusta was one of the most notorious potion makers in 1st century Rome. We know little about her life, other than that she died in the year 69 AD, and that she was an expert maker of poisons. It's believed she took part in 2 of the major assassinations of the century, that of Claudius and Britannicus. The Emperor Nero also hired her to become a sort of poison schoolmaster, teaching others how to use herbs and natural substances to create the deadliest concoctions in the Roman Empire. But in typical Roman fashion, Locusta was favored by one emperor and despised by the next. Locusta was in prison following the assassination of Claudius when Nero asked for her help in the assassination of Britannicus, Claudius's son. When she was successful, Nero awarded her a vast country estate where she could teach others the art of poison and live her life in luxury. But after Nero fled Rome in 68 AD and died, the Emperor Galba saw Locusta as a filthy worm. He differed vastly from Nero and wanted to purge Rome of all the people he viewed as scum who had risen to the surface in those dark days. So Locusta was paraded through the city in chains and then executed. The First Genocide. Yale historians report it was the Romans who committed the very first known genocide in history. They carried out the complete and strategic annihilation of a people in the year 264 BC. It started with Rome and Carthage. Rome was a massive superpower on the northern side of the Mediterranean Sea, while Carthage was an equally impressive superpower on the southern part of the sea, in North Africa, what is today Tunisia. It was inevitable the 2 great powers would go to war, and that's exactly what they did several times. They fought 3 wars known as the Punic Wars. The first and second saw Rome gain control of huge parts of Spain and most of the western Mediterranean. The Third Punic War in 149 BC saw the genocide of the Carthaginian people. Roman soldiers, under the command of Scipio Africanus, landed in Africa and laid siege to the city of Carthage. The city was broken, the Romans poured in, the people could barely defend themselves, and the slaughter began. Historians say the Roman soldiers went from house to house, killing every single person they could find. The city had about 200,000 inhabitants when they entered. By the time the Romans were done, there were only about 30,000 left, and they sold all these people as slaves and sent them to the furthest corners of the empire. In just one battle, the Romans had wiped out the entire race of Carthaginians. The danger of being emperor. Being the emperor of Rome might seem like a glorified position, but it was quite terrifying unless you were very tough. The dark truth of being a Roman emperor is that you were probably going to die young, or at least soon. There was a very high percentage of it. Researchers looked at the reign of every ruler of the Roman Empire over 4 centuries, 69 leaders in total. The researchers found that 43 to 62% of them died from unnatural causes. What this means is that they only had about a 38% chance of not being assassinated, killed in combat, or executed. To give you some perspective, you would have a better chance of climbing Mount Everest than surviving as a ruler of the Roman Empire. Joseph Saleh from the Georgia Institute of Technology says being a Roman emperor was playing Russian roulette with 4 bullets in the cylinder. The first year had the highest risk of violent death because of family members and political rivals looking to grab power. The risk of death then stabilized roughly by the 8th year, but would increase by year 12 out of pure fatigue. The Barbarian Invasions. There were a lot of different ways in which the Roman Empire gradually collapsed, but if it hadn't been for the Barbarian Invasions starting around 200 BC, they probably wouldn't have collapsed quite so violently. The barbarians were the Germanic people who lived outside the Western Roman Empire's borders and started moving into Roman territory. These were tribes who wielded battle axes and originated from the coast of the North Sea near Viking territory. They were descendants of the corded ware culture, a great people who lived in obscurity up until they suddenly didn't. The Germanic people had the disadvantage of not belonging to a single major civilization. Their people had been crushed during the Iron Age by the Celts and the Illyrians, and over the years they had become little more than nomadic bands. But by 200 BC, their numbers were increasing. The climate was getting worse in the north, and it was time for them to move to better lands in the south. Before the true invasion started, the Roman Empire had already been more or less taken over by the Germanic people. They were already part of their society as immigrants. Many of them were recruits in the legions, captured and forced to be slaves in the Roman army. Even the emperors had bands of barbarian mercenaries to protect them. Slowly, the barbarians encroached on the Roman borders. They appeared in Carinthia in 113 BC, then made it to the south of France, and finally into Italy in the year 102. But these were just fringe groups, small pockets of the population who moved in and settled down. It wouldn't be until 150 AD when unrest among the tribes that lived all along the Roman borders started a war. Rome found itself surrounded by those countless hordes that had taken root along their edges. And before anyone could really stop it, Rome was finished. France was occupied by the Franks, the Saxons were in Britain, the Vandals were in Spain, and the Goths descended on Rome, signaling the beginning of the end of the empire. The rise of Christianity. Believe it or not, the rise of Christianity was directly responsible for at least some aspects of the collapse of the Roman Empire. In fact, this may sound a little familiar, but historians say it was the introduction of Christianity and the loss of traditional values in society which fractured Rome beyond repair. Scholars can't agree on the exact steps that Christianity took to become a global religion. It's believed that in the province of Judea, within the Roman Empire, there were only about 1,000 Christian believers. The religion then grew at a rate of roughly 3.4% every year, compounding each year until it completely took over. By the end of the year 200, Rome was about half populated by Christians, and this was when trouble began. Half of Rome was Christian and the other half was still pagan. This caused conflict and violence and made society weaker. But it wasn't just a population divided, it was the emperor pushing down on them too. Constantine the Great, Roman emperor from 306 to 337 AD, decided he would eradicate paganism. His efforts to convert the entirety of Roman society led to strife, misery, and general unrest. He basically pressured the entire empire to give up the old gods they'd been worshipping for thousands of years. And it worked. If you were practicing paganism in the time of Constantine, it usually ended either in death or being tortured until you converted. There wasn't really a choice. Either you changed religions or you became the enemy. Of course, other factors such as plague and disease also helped encourage people to convert. Too many emperors. There were too many emperors in Rome, and there was a lot of turnover. Emperors didn't last very long, which didn't help with stability. In fact, historians say that Roman emperors had a higher chance of dying from a gruesome death than a gladiator. Every gladiator that walked into the arena had a better chance of surviving to old age than a Roman emperor did of surviving his first year of rule. From between the years 14 to 395, 43 out of 69 emperors died violent deaths, either slain in battle or assassinated. That is a whopping 62%. Here are some disturbing examples. Emperor Publius Septimius Geta died in the year 211 at 21 years old when his brother had him slaughtered in his own mother's arms. Then his brother, Karakala, was murdered 6 years later while using the bathroom on the side of a road. Marcus Aurelius Commodus was another famous emperor who died in 192 after a wrestler was sent to strangle him while he took a bath. Caligula ruled for 4 years, Tacitus 6 months. Didius Julianus ruled for 2 months and 6 days. The list goes on and on. Basically, being a Roman emperor was playing Russian roulette. The average ruler lasted about 8 years, and when the fear of death lay that close, it was hard for a lot of these guys to take care of their empire when they couldn't even keep their own heads. An empire divided. When the Roman Empire split in half, it sealed its own fate. The division changed Roman life and government forever. The government began to have some major issues ruling the vastness of its territory. This was happening while the barbarian tribes were slowly funneling into the unclaimed lands at the fringes of the empire. It was a huge problem, but the Romans really didn't have the resources to protect themselves. Their legions couldn't be everywhere at once. To fix this problem, Emperor Diocletian divided Rome into two halves in the year 286. This was already a time of serious instability, both internally and externally. And while it seemed like a good idea to have the Western Roman Empire with its capital in Milan and the Eastern Roman Empire with its capital in Byzantium, what would become Constantinople, it didn't work out. At least it didn't work out for the West. Instead of functioning as two halves of the same empire, they just became their own empires. When the barbarian hordes descended on Rome in 410, Byzantium did nothing. The West collapsed in 476, yet the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, would live on until 1453. Shout out time! I want to give a big shout out to Gabriel Solomon 111 and Lauren Mettink. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe for more videos like these. Greed and taxes. Greed and taxation played a big role in the collapse of Rome. We already know that the barbarians slowly chipped away at the empire until they were close enough to strike at its heart. But this was only possible because of the Romans themselves, who had been milked so hard by their emperors that they didn't really care what happened as long as they didn't die. A lot of this had to do with taxation. The wealthiest people in society profited off the hard work of the less fortunate. Rome's fortune was originally in the land, but this gave way to wealth through taxation. Each province made a tidy sum from taxing their farmers, and they kicked that money up the ladder to the big guys in Rome. The taxation problem was so serious that many farmers abandoned their land and sold themselves into slavery. The idea was that since slaves couldn't pay taxes or own land, yet had to do the same work as the farmer, it was less stressful to live life as a Roman slave. This grew to be such a big problem that Emperor Valens made it illegal in 368. Nevertheless, the damage was done. When your own people would rather be slaves than pay taxes, clearly something is wrong. Lazy and uncaring citizens. There is a theory that Roman citizens became lazy and apathetic to their own empire, allowing it to collapse. We already know they were being taxed to the max, and that they were being forced to convert from their traditional religion to Christianity. These are two social issues that caused quite a bit of tension in Rome. However, it was widely believed that the civilization wasn't even worth rescuing at the time of Rome's collapse. Just like today, the majority of people believed they had been forgotten and squashed under the foot of their government. They knew that only the rich and powerful were prospering, and it made them completely indifferent to the problems of the empire as a whole. If you're hungry, who cares what's really happening at the top? As the years went on and the empire got bigger and the emperors got greedier, the people suffered more. This was especially true for the Roman soldiers. When the men returned from the army, they would usually find themselves without a job and homeless. So it was that when the fall came on quickly, most citizens couldn't have cared less. They got lazy, they hated their own government, and they were looking for a change. Failing military. In the beginning of Rome, her military might was astounding, but by the end, things weren't so great. The army buckled under its own weight and came crashing down with the rest of the empire. The first real major defeat came in the year 53 BC, when Marcus Licinius Crassus provoked a war with the Parthian Empire for no real reason. The Senate was opposed to it, but the emperor pushed ahead and started the war. 50,000 men sailed to Syria in the year 55 BC to wipe it off the map, but as they entered the Great Desert, an army of about 10,000 Parthians ambushed them. It was bloody anarchy. Over 20,000 Romans were massacred, and 10,000 were taken prisoner. Crassus was murdered, and the Romans were hugely embarrassed. And that was only the start. Then there was the disaster in the Teutoburg forest. 3 Roman legions were ambushed and slaughtered by barbarian tribesmen as they tried pushing into their territory. Many soldiers died there in the forest, and this is considered a major turning point in history. The barbarians knew how to overwhelm and crush the Roman legions in the forest by using different fighting tactics. There was also the Battle of Edessa in 260 AD, after 50 years of almost anarchy inside the empire. There were 26 claims made to the throne, almost entirely from Roman generals. Since they were battling among themselves, this is when Rome's internal conflicts really started to show. In the spring of 260, the Sassanid Empire attacked western Mesopotamia, which was right at the edge of the Roman Empire. To stop the threat in its tracks, Emperor Valerian gathered 70,000 troops, barbarian allies, and traveled to fight back the Persians. But they got infected by a plague and couldn't fight. So Valerian chose to negotiate with the Persian ruler Shapur, and was immediately taken prisoner and shipped back to Persia. It was the first time in Roman history that an emperor was taken by the enemy. With their leader gone, the Romans surrendered without even putting up a fight. The fall of the Republic. The Roman Republic was the first real world democracy and the foundation for most democracies today. The Republic had a constitution, very specific laws, there were elected officials, and there was a ruling body of senators. However, the Roman Republic was complicated enough to allow corruption to spread. The difficulties expanded along with the Republic as it grew. Economic disasters, major government corruption, people with their own private armies, and the rise of Julius Caesar as the emperor. The Republic didn't have an emperor in title. This is what a lot of people don't realize. Before the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic thrived for 500 years as a legitimate government that didn't need a single power figure. But when the corruption got out of hand, that all changed. Government officials allowed themselves to be bribed to make decisions for their powerful friends. And once this started, everything came crashing down. The rich could do whatever they wanted, and the commoners no longer trusted the Senate. Then came Julius Caesar, who formed an alliance with Pompey the Great and Marcus Crassus, the guy who fruitlessly tried to invade Syria and died. When Crassus was gone, Julius defeated Pompey in battle and declared himself the Emperor of Rome. On that day, the Roman Republic was dead, and the Roman Empire was born. After leaving democracy and becoming a dictatorship, Rome never went back. The Great Goth King. In the summer of 410 AD, the great Goth king Alaric sacked the city of Rome. This hadn't been done in over 800 years. He brought his barbarian army through the front gates of the imperial city and plundered it like Rome was just some seaside fishing village. And even though the city did survive for nearly a century more, this was the end of the Roman Empire. When the great Goth king entered Rome, he pillaged, burned down the pagan temples, destroyed the old house of the Senate, kidnapped the emperor's sister, and treated the place like his own personal amusement park. After the destruction, King Alaric and his soldiers simply left. They didn't want to stay in Rome. They'd already taken everything and left Rome in pieces, and so they traveled to Gaul. Alaric died from illness shortly after. His brother Athalf took over leadership of the Goths, and his wife, after Athalf's death, married the Roman Emperor Constantius. Their son would later serve as emperor. The true fall of Rome came in 476, when the barbarian overlord Odoacer rode into Italy and deposed all the remaining Roman nobility. The Dark Ages. To understand the consequences of the fall of the Roman Empire, we need to look at the Dark Ages. This bleak period of history began in 476, with the official collapse of Rome, and it continued for 900 years until the Renaissance. It's called the Dark Ages because many scholars suggest there was pretty much nothing in the way of scientific or cultural advancement. Europe was still recovering after the chaos of Rome, and it took them nearly 1,000 years to move forward with new technologies and new ideas. Basically, the Dark Ages were the stagnant years. In truth, there was a lot going on. It just wasn't quite as exciting as what had come before. Pretty much all of Europe was Christian now, and so for 900 years, most rulers were focused on building Christian empires. Without Rome to hold everything in place, the church in Western Europe became the only element of stability. It was the church that pretty much replaced Rome as the mother of Europe and dominated everything up until very recently. The term Dark Ages actually refers to the centuries after the fall of Rome, where there was a return to the past with no records, as opposed to the light of classical antiquity. The classical era was considered to be full of literature and the arts, progress in science and technology. But the Dark Ages now is more accurately considered the early Middle Ages. But it does bring to mind times of war, destruction, and death. Thanks for watching! Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and come back soon for more videos on amazing history. Bye!